The desperate wail of a hungry infant echoed through the modest cabin as Henry Stanton paced frantically, turning over every blanket, searching beneath every piece of furniture, his normally steady hands trembling with exhaustion and worry. 6-month-old Emma hadn't stopped crying for nearly an hour, and the absence of her wooden pacifier was pushing both father and daughter to their limits. The Arizona Territory of 1878 was unforgiving to most, but especially to a widowed father. Henry had lost his wife, Sarah, to childbirth fever, leaving him alone to raise their daughter in the harsh reality of frontier life. At 32, the former cavalry scout had thought he'd faced every challenge the West could offer until parenthood proved him wrong. Shush now, little one," Henry whispered, bouncing Emma gently as he continued his search. The small cabin that had once felt spacious now seemed impossibly cluttered, hiding the one thing that would bring his daughter comfort. The wooden pacifier, carved by a traveling peddler months earlier, had become Emma's most prized possession, and now it was gone. Henry's weathered face creased with worry. The trading post was 2 days' ride away, and he couldn't possibly make the journey with Emma in this state. The nearest neighbor was Charlotte Wells, a newcomer who'd taken over her uncle's abandoned homestead about a mile down the creek. They'd exchanged polite greetings at church socials, but Henry had kept mostly to himself since Sarah's passing. "We'll find it, sweetheart, I promise," he murmured, kissing Emma's feverish forehead as another round of wailing began. Outside, the spring sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the dusty yard. Henry knew he had no choice but to seek help. Wrapping Emma in her mother's quilt, he stepped outside and saddled his mare with one arm, balancing his daughter against his chest with the other. The ride to the Wells homestead was mercifully short, but Emma's cries only intensified with the motion of the horse. As they approached the small cabin nestled against a stand of cottonwoods, Henry saw Charlotte in the yard, hanging laundry on a line stretched between 2 trees. At 26, Charlotte Wells had come west following her husband's death in a mining accident, determined to make a life for herself away from Pittsburgh's sooty skies. Her uncle's abandoned homestead offered the fresh start she needed, though many in town whispered that a woman alone couldn't possibly succeed. She turned at the sound of hoofbeats, shielding her eyes against the setting sun. When she recognized Henry and his crying child, she immediately dropped the sheet she was hanging and hurried toward them. "Mr. Stanton? Is everything all right?" Her voice carried over Emma's cries. Henry dismounted awkwardly, still clutching his daughter. "Miss Wells, I apologize for the intrusion, but I'm at my wit's end. Emma's pacifier is lost, and she won't settle without it." Charlotte's expression softened as she approached. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and her simple work dress was dusted with flour. "The poor dear," she said, reaching out instinctively. To Henry's surprise, Emma paused her crying momentarily, distracted by the new face. Charlotte smiled warmly and held out her arms. "May I?" Henry hesitated, then carefully transferred his daughter. Charlotte cradled Emma expertly, swaying gently as she spoke in soothing tones. "There now, little one. What's all this fuss about?" "I've looked everywhere," Henry explained, running a hand through his disheveled brown hair. "It's a small wooden pacifier, about this big." He gestured with his fingers. "I can't make the trip to the trading post right now, and she's been crying for hours." Charlotte nodded thoughtfully, still rocking Emma, who had reduced her wailing to hiccuping sobs. "Come inside, Mr. Stanton. I might be able to help." Inside the cabin, Charlotte's homestead revealed a woman of considerable resourcefulness. Despite having been in the territory less than a year, she had transformed the abandoned cabin into a comfortable home. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, handmade curtains framed the windows, and her father's old carpentry tools hung on one wall, meticulously arranged. "Please sit," Charlotte said, nodding toward a chair at her small table. "Would you mind holding her again for a moment?" Henry took Emma back, noticing how his daughter's crying had quieted to intermittent whimpers in Charlotte's presence. He watched as Charlotte moved to a wooden chest and retrieved a small leather roll. Unfurling it on the table revealed a set of carving tools that gleamed with care. "These were my father's," she explained, selecting a small knife. "He was a furniture maker in Pennsylvania. He taught me everything he knew." She moved to a shelf and selected a small piece of pine from a collection of wood scraps. Henry's eyebrows rose. "You're going to make her a pacifier?" Charlotte nodded, already examining the wood. "It shouldn't be too difficult." "What was the old one like?" As Henry described the lost pacifier, Charlotte listened carefully, her green eyes focused on the wood she was beginning to shape. Her hands moved with practiced confidence, the knife carving away thin curls of pine. "My pa always said there wasn't much in this world that couldn't be fixed with the right tools and a bit of patience," Charlotte said, her voice gentle as she worked. "I suppose that's why I brought his tools west with me, even though everyone said a woman had no business with such things." Henry watched in fascination as the shape of a small pacifier began to emerge from the wood. Emma had settled somewhat in his arms, exhausted from her hours of crying, but still fussing periodically. "If you don't mind my asking, how long have you been on your own with her?" Charlotte asked, her eyes still on her work. 8 months, Henry replied, his voice tight with the memory. "Sarah. She had a fever after Emma came. The doctor from Fort Collins couldn't get here in time." Charlotte nodded solemnly. "I'm truly sorry, Mr. Stanton. My William was taken in a cave 2 years ago. We'd been married 3 years." Their shared grief hung in the air between them, a silent understanding passing in the quiet cabin as Charlotte continued to carve. After about 30 minutes, she held up the small wooden creation, examining it critically before reaching for a piece of fine sandpaper. "Just need to make sure there are no splinters," she explained, carefully smoothing the wood. "Can't have your little one getting hurt." When she finally handed the finished pacifier to Henry, he marveled at the craftsmanship. It was a simple design, but perfectly shaped with a small handle and a rounded end for Emma's mouth. Charlotte had even carved tiny ridges on the mouthpiece. "Let's see if she'll take it," Charlotte suggested. Henry gently offered the wooden pacifier to Emma, who initially turned her head away, still hiccuping with residual tears. But when Charlotte dipped the tip in a small pot of honey and tried again, Emma cautiously accepted it, her tiny lips closing around the wooden comfort. Within moments, her eyes began to droop as the soothing action calmed her. Charlotte's face broke into a radiant smile when Emma's cries finally ceased completely. "It worked," she whispered, her eyes meeting Henry's. The relief that flooded through Henry was overwhelming. "Miss Wells, I don't know how to thank you. You've saved us both tonight." "Charlotte, please," she insisted. "And there's no need for thanks. Neighbors help neighbors out here. That's how we all survive." As Emma finally drifted asleep, pacifier firmly in place, Henry realized he'd been holding his breath. The peaceful expression on his daughter's face was worth more than gold to him. When he looked up at Charlotte, something shifted in his perception of her. She wasn't just the woman who'd taken over Old Man Wells' property anymore. She was someone with skill and kindness that had touched his life in a profound way. "You should stay for supper," Charlotte offered, moving to stir the stew simmering over the fire. "It's nothing fancy, just rabbit and whatever vegetables I could coax from the garden, but there's plenty." Henry knew he should politely decline, return to his own homestead, maintain the careful distance he'd kept from everyone since Sarah's passing. But Emma was finally sleeping soundly, and the prospect of a meal he hadn't prepared himself was unexpectedly appealing. "That's very kind," he found himself saying. "If you're certain it's no trouble." Charlotte's smile was warm as she ladled stew into 2 bowls. "No trouble at all." As they ate, conversation came more easily than Henry had anticipated. Charlotte told him about her journey west, the challenges of taking over her uncle's neglected homestead, and her determination to prove the naysayers wrong. Henry shared stories of his time as a cavalry scout, the small triumphs of his wheat crop, and the daily challenges of raising Emma alone. "The hardest part is not knowing if I'm doing right by her," Henry admitted, glancing at his sleeping daughter, nestled in a makeshift bed of blankets Charlotte had arranged. "Sarah would have known what to do." Charlotte's gaze was sympathetic but firm. "From what I can see, you're doing just fine, Henry. That little girl is healthy and loved. That's what matters most." By the time they finished their meal, night had fully descended on the Arizona territory. Henry reluctantly prepared to leave, carefully wrapping Emma in her blanket once more. "I can't thank you enough for this," he said, holding up the wooden pacifier that had brought such peace. "If there's ever anything I can do to repay you—" "Actually," Charlotte interjected, "there is something." She hesitated, then continued. "My roof has a leak that I haven't been able to reach. If you could spare an afternoon someday to help me patch it, I'd be grateful." Henry nodded immediately. "Of course. I could come by tomorrow if that suits you." "That would be perfect," Charlotte replied, walking them to the door. "Good night, Henry." "Good night, little Emma." As Henry rode home under a canopy of stars, his daughter sleeping peacefully against his chest, he felt something he hadn't experienced in months' hope. The wooden pacifier had not only quieted Emma's cries, but had somehow opened a door he'd thought permanently closed. True to his word, Henry returned the next day. What should have been a simple roof repair turned into a full day's work as he discovered several other issues that needed attention. Charlotte worked alongside him, handing up tools and shingles, her capable hands as busy as his own. By sunset, they had not only fixed the roof, but had also repaired a sagging porch step and a broken window latch. "You've done in one day what would have taken me weeks," Charlotte said as they shared a simple supper of cornbread and beans. "I'm much obliged." Henry watched as she played with Emma, who had taken a surprising liking to Charlotte. "Seems we make a good team," he observed, the word surprising even himself. Over the following weeks, a pattern emerged. Henry would find reasons to visit Charlotte's homestead, bringing extra vegetables from his garden, offering to help with heavier chores, seeking advice about Emma's increasingly frequent fussiness as she began teething. Charlotte, in turn, began to stop by his cabin, sometimes bringing freshly baked bread or simply offering to watch Emma while he tended to pressing farm tasks. The residents of nearby Sweetwater took notice of the developing friendship between the widower and the independent newcomer. Gossip spread, as it inevitably did in small frontier communities, but neither Henry nor Charlotte paid it much mind. They had found in each other something valuable: companionship in a land where loneliness was as common as dust storms. Summer arrived with blazing heat and the promise of a good harvest. Henry's wheat fields stretched golden under the relentless sun, and Charlotte's garden flourished despite the challenging climate. They developed a routine of Sunday dinners after church, alternating between their homesteads, their lives gradually intertwining in ways both practical and profound. On a particularly scorching July afternoon, disaster struck. Henry was harvesting wheat when he spotted the telltale column of smoke rising from the direction of Charlotte's homestead. Without hesitation, he grabbed Emma from her shaded basket, mounted his horse, and rode hard toward the smoke. He arrived to find Charlotte frantically throwing buckets of water on a fire that had started in her root cellar and spread to the kitchen. The dry summer conditions had turned the modest fire into a serious threat. The lantern fell. She gasped between efforts, her face streaked with soot. "I couldn't catch it in time." Henry immediately joined her fight against the flames, organizing a bucket brigade between the well and the house. For over an hour, they battled the fire and eventually managed to contain it, though the kitchen and part of the main room were badly damaged. Exhausted and smoke-stained, Charlotte finally collapsed onto a stump in the yard, surveying the damage to her hard-won home. "All that work," she whispered, tears cutting clean tracks through the soot on her face. Henry sat beside her, Emma cradled in one arm. Without thinking, he reached for Charlotte's hand with his free one. "We'll rebuild it," he said firmly. "Together." Charlotte looked at him, surprise evident in her reddened eyes. "We will." "That's what neighbors do," Henry said, echoing her words from months ago. But even as he spoke them, he knew that neighbors no longer adequately described what they had become to each other. The fire created a new chapter in their relationship. Charlotte and Emma moved temporarily into Henry's cabin while repairs to her homestead began. The arrangement was meant to last only a few days, but days stretched into weeks as they realized the extent of the damage. The proximity forced a new intimacy between them, sharing meals, coordinating daily chores, creating routines that accommodated both the growing infant and the demands of two homesteads. In the evenings, after Emma was asleep, they would sit on Henry's porch, watching the sunset paint the Arizona sky in spectacular hues. On one such evening, as they discussed plans for reinforcing Charlotte's root cellar, Henry suddenly fell silent, his expression thoughtful. "What is it?" Charlotte asked, noticing the change. Henry turned to her, his usually steady hands fidgeting with his hat. "I've been thinking," he began, then hesitated. "This arrangement. Having you and Emma under one roof. It's been good." Charlotte nodded, her eyes carefully trained on the distant horizon. "It has," she agreed softly. "I know it's only temporary until your place is fixed," Henry continued, "but I've started to wonder if it needs to be." The air between them seemed to still. Charlotte slowly turned to face him, her expression unreadable in the fading light. "What exactly are you saying, Henry?" Henry took a deep breath. "I'm saying that Emma needs a mother. And I need a partner. A wife." He reached for her hand. "I know it's not the most romantic proposal, but I care for you, Charlotte. Deeply. And I believe we could build a good life together." Charlotte withdrew her hand, her reaction not what Henry had expected. "Is that all this is to you? A practical arrangement? Emma needs a mother, so I'll do." Henry immediately recognized his misstep. "No, that's not what I meant at all. Because if that's what you're offering Henry Stanton, then my answer is no." Charlotte stood, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "I didn't come west to be anyone's convenient solution." Before Henry could respond, she had disappeared inside the cabin, leaving him alone with his regret and the realization that he had completely mishandled the most important conversation of his life since proposing to Sarah. The following days were tense, with conversation limited to necessary topics about Emma's care and homestead repairs. Henry cursed himself repeatedly for his clumsy words, for failing to express what was truly in his heart. A week after his failed proposal, Henry rode into Sweetwater for supplies. At the general store, Mrs. Patterson, the storekeeper's wife, asked about Charlotte. "How is Miss Wells settling in at your place?" she inquired, a knowing gleam in her eye as she wrapped his purchases. "She's just staying until her homestead is repaired," Henry replied stiffly. Mrs. Patterson nodded sagely. "Of course. Though many of us have noticed how good she is with little Emma, and how you look at her when you think no one's watching." Henry paused in counting out his payment. "And how is that, Mrs. Patterson?" The older woman smiled. "Like she's the water in the desert, Mr. Stanton. Like she's your second chance." Her words followed Henry all the way home, echoing in his mind as he considered what to do. By the time he reached his cabin, he had formed a plan. The next morning, Henry was up before dawn. He asked Charlotte to watch Emma for a few hours, offering no explanation for his absence. He rode to the small grove of cottonwoods near the creek where they had first picnicked together months earlier, searching until he found exactly what he needed, a perfect piece of fallen hardwood. Returning to the barn behind his cabin, Henry set up his rarely used workbench. Though not as skilled as Charlotte with woodworking, he had learned enough over his years on the frontier to fashion simple items. Today, however, he was attempting something more ambitious. Hours later, Covered in sawdust and nursing several minor cuts, Henry examined his creation. It was far from perfect, the lines weren't as clean as they could be, and the finish was rougher than he'd intended, but it was made with genuine feeling. That evening, after Emma was asleep, Henry found Charlotte sitting on the porch, mending one of his shirts by lamplight. He sat beside her, the wrapped package in his hands. "I made something for you," he said simply, offering the bundle. Charlotte set aside her mending and accepted it, curiosity overcoming the reserve that had characterized their interactions since his failed proposal. She unwrapped the cloth to reveal a wooden box, roughly the size of a book. The lid was carved with an intricate pattern of wildflowers, the same ones that grew along the creek near her homestead. "Open it," Henry encouraged gently. Inside, nestled on a bed of soft cloth, was Emma's original wooden pacifier, the one Charlotte had carved that first night. Henry had found it 2 days earlier, caught in a corner of Emma's cradle. "I don't understand," Charlotte said, looking up at him with confusion. Henry took her hand, more certain now than he had been a week ago. "This pacifier brought you into our lives. You carved it from nothing when we needed help, and it changed everything." He paused, gathering his courage. "I didn't say things right before. I talked about practicality when I should have spoken from my heart." He moved from the bench to one knee before her, still holding her hand. "Charlotte Wells, I love you. Not because you're good with Emma, though you are. Not because you're practical, though that's a blessing too. I love your strength, your kindness, your skilled hands, and your generous heart. I love the way you see beauty in simple things and possibility where others see only hardship." Charlotte's eyes glistened in the lamplight, but she remained silent, letting him continue. "I'm not asking you to be a convenient mother for Emma. I'm asking if you would consider joining your life with mine, building something together that's stronger than what either of us could create alone." He squeezed her hand gently. "I'm asking if you might love me too, despite my fumbling words and rough edges." For a long moment, Charlotte was still, her expression unreadable. Then, slowly, she placed the wooden box on the bench beside her and rose, pulling Henry to his feet as well. "Henry Stanton," she said, her voice steady though her hand trembled in his, "I came west to build a new life. I never expected that life would include love again." She stepped closer. "But it has. I do love you, your dedication to Emma, your honesty, your willingness to help others without hesitation. Even your fumbling words." Relief and joy swept through Henry as he drew her into his arms. Their first kiss was tentative, then deepened with the months of growing affection that had led them to this moment. When they finally parted, both were breathless. "Is that a yes?" Henry asked, his forehead resting against hers. Charlotte laughed, the sound bright in the quiet evening. "Yes. That's definitely a yes." They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Sweetwater, with Emma babbling happily throughout the ceremony. Charlotte wore a dress of pale blue calico, with wildflowers in her hair. Henry, freshly shaved and wearing his one good suit, couldn't take his eyes off her as they spoke their vows before the assembled townsfolk. The rebuilding of Charlotte's homestead became a wedding present of sorts from the community. What would have taken months for the couple to complete alone was finished in just 2 weeks, with improvements that made the cabin more spacious and secure than before. They decided to keep both properties, using Charlotte's homestead as additional farmland and a place to expand their agricultural efforts. As autumn painted the landscape in russet and gold, their life together settled into a rhythm of shared work and quiet joy. Emma took her first steps in the yard between their main cabin and the barn, toddling determinately from Charlotte to Henry with triumphant squeals. The wooden pacifier that had brought them together was eventually retired to the carved box, a keepsake of their unusual beginning. Winter came early that year, bringing heavy snows and bitter cold. On the longest night of December, as wind howled around their snug cabin, Charlotte felt the first fluttering movements of new life within her. She placed Henry's hand on her still, flat stomach, watching his eyes widen with wonder. "Are you certain?" he whispered, afraid to hope. Charlotte nodded, her smile radiant in the firelight. "The baby should arrive by midsummer. Emma will have a brother or sister to grow up with." Henry gathered her into his arms, overcome with gratitude for this woman who had carved not only a pacifier from wood, but a place in his broken heart. "I love you," he murmured against her hair. "More than I have words to say." "You don't need words," Charlotte replied, leaning into his embrace. "I can see it in everything you do." By the following Christmas, their family had grown to include twin boys, Samuel and James, whose lusty cries often echoed through the expanded cabin. Emma, now nearly 2, was a devoted big sister, frequently attempting to soothe her brothers with her own special wooden pacifier that Charlotte had carved for her. On a snowy evening 5 years after they first met, Henry and Charlotte sat before the fire, watching their children play on the rug. Emma, now a spirited 5-year-old with her father's determination and her stepmother's creativity, was showing her brothers how to build towers with wooden blocks Henry had made. "Do you ever think about how different our lives might have been if Emma hadn't lost that pacifier?" Charlotte asked, leaning against Henry's shoulder. Henry smiled, wrapping his arm around his wife. "Every day. It was the luckiest misplacement of my life." He kissed her temple gently. Who would have thought that something so small could lead to something so wonderful? Charlotte's hand found his, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of deep love. That's how most important things begin, I think, with small moments that change everything. Outside, snow continued to fall on their thriving homestead, the barn full of healthy livestock, the root cellar stocked for winter, the fields resting beneath a white blanket until spring's return. Inside, warmed by fire and family, Henry and Charlotte Stanton had created something neither had thought possible when they first met: a home built on love, strengthened by shared challenges, and filled with the laughter of children who would grow up knowing the value of both practical skills and open hearts. And in the carved wooden box on their mantel, a simple pacifier remained a small testament to the truth that sometimes, when we can't find what we're looking for, we discover exactly what we need.